Begin looking at our tissues. So we had a little bit of an introduction into the tissues in lab material as well. Now we'll take a little bit deeper look into them. Between lab and lecture, there's going to be quite a bit of overlap between the information for tissues themselves. But for the most part, for lab, it's going to be identification from a slide. And for lecture, it's going to be identification from essentially a description of either the epithelium, the connective, the muscle, or the nervous tissue are four types of tissue that we have. And so we'll begin with epithelial tissue. And each of the tissues kind of have some hallmark characteristics that we can see within each one. And so with epithelial tissue, it tends to be very cellular. And so when we look at the tissue, it appears to be all cells. Within those cells, we won't see any blood vessels because it is avascular. So there's no blood supply that goes up to them. And although there's no blood supply, there is innervation. So we do have nervous input into the tissue itself. Epithelial tissue has a beginning and an end, and so it does show polarity. And so it has a beginning point, and then the cells grow up from there, and maybe they're stacked on top of them. We have a stratified variety, and so we have a basal surface, and then we have an apical surface within the tissues themselves. Those cells are going to be held together by things like tight junctions, so nice and welded tightly together, or even desmosomes to give them the structure and the strength to the tissue itself as well. If we should happen to lose some of these cells, so if some of these cells fall off, get scraped off, what have you, the tissue is very highly regenerative, and we're going to add more cells underneath, and that's going to push them back out. So they're highly regenerative. This can sometimes be as quickly as just a few days. For our first epithelium, we have simple squamous. And so when we're looking at epithelium, some of the things that we need to keep in mind are the cell shape and the cell thickness in terms of how many cells are stacked on top of one another. And so with simple squamous epithelium, we have a single cell layer, and the cells themselves are flattened out cells. And so when we look at them under a microscope, like we have here, they're going to tend to look essentially like little discs almost. They're flattened out little cells. Each one of the dark spots is a nucleus, and we can see that we have individual cells there. So this gives us a very thin membrane, which is going to allow us to do things like exchange gases. It's going to allow us to exchange substances in between the layers themselves. And so this brings us to the next thing that we need to know, which is where do we find these things? And so where do we find this type of epithelium within the body? And that's what you have there under the location. Typically, some of the larger areas where we're going to find them are going to be listed first. And so those are going to be the areas where we see the greatest amount of those particular tissues. Simple cuboidal, we now have a single layer of cells. The cells tend to look under a microscope like a square, and so they're equal height and width. And so if we look at this cell over here, we have roughly equal height and width to it as well. You can see the nice dark basement membrane there around the edge as well. And so that denotes the beginning of the tissue. And so since that's the beginning of the tissue, we then, in a sense, kind of follow out through the cell, and then we come to the end. We have our apical tissue, and we have empty space there. And so it's always beginning and ending on an empty space out on the outside. For simple cuboidal, we find these in exactly the same places where we see it in the microscope slide there, in places like the kidney tubules. Some of our larger structures within them are going to have all of these tubules running through them within the kidneys. And then we can see them in places like the glands. And so we can see them in glandular tissue, which we'll talk about later on. Simple columnar, we have cells that are taller than they are wide. So these cells now have a column type of a shape. Once again, they are a single cell layer thick. And so we have our basal surface down here. We have our apical surface over here within the tissue. This is our first variety where we have essentially more than one kind. And so there are ciliated and non-ciliated varieties of simple columnar. The largest areas where we see them are non-ciliated like this tissue here, which is in places like the digestive tract. Ciliated variety would have little finger-like extensions coming out of the top of the cell. So those would be there all along the surface of the cell, and we see those along there. And so the non-ciliated variety is in places like the digestive tract. The ciliated variety is going to be in places like the fallopian tubes or the uterine tubes. And with those tubes, that's going to allow them to push the structures or the egg down through the fallopian tube itself. Next up, we have our first glimpse at something that is more than one layer thick, except for here we have actually a single layer of cells. They all begin at the basal surface, but not all of them make it up to the apical surface, and so not all of them are the same height. And so when we look at the individual cells, we see that some are very tall, and we see that some are shorter. And so not all of the cells are going to make it out to the surface itself there. This also comes in a ciliated and a non-ciliated variety. In the picture here we have the ciliated variety. And so we can see all those little finger-like extensions coming out of the cells themselves there. This is going to be found along the respiratory tract, and so parts of the trachea, parts of the upper respiratory tract itself. And then for the non-ciliated varieties, we're going to see these along the male reproductive ducts or in large glands. Stratified squamous epithelium now has multiple layers, and so it all begins down here along the basal surface, and cell after cell after cell stacks up all the way out to the apical surface. Towards the basal side, the tissue looks a lot like cuboidal cells, but as they make their way out towards the surface, they become more and more flattened out. They become a lot wider than they are tall, and that gives us the hallmark of squamous cells themselves. Again, two varieties. The one pictured here is our non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. We also have keratinized. The keratinized variety is going to have an extra layer of dead cells out on the surface. So those dead cells provide us with abrasion protection, and this is what we find out on the skin, versus the non-keratinized we find in places like the oral cavity going down into the esophagus. We now have stratified components for cuboidal and columnar as well, but these are both relatively rare within the body itself. And so they do have two layers to them. So here we have one layer, two layers of our stratified cuboidal. These ones we're going to find in oftentimes relatively narrow areas of the tissue that we're supposed to find them in. And so even within sweat glands and mammary glands, we may not actually find them depending upon where the slide was, where the tissue was acquired from. Same thing goes for stratified columnar, because stratified columnar is typically found in a transition area. It's only going to be found in a limited portion of the pharynx or the urethra, things like that. And so it's only going to be found in that small little area where we're going from one kind of a epithelium to another, typically from a stratified to a non-stratified. From there we have transitional epithelium, and transitional epithelium kind of breaks the rules in a sense. It is stratified, and so there is more than one layer there, but the thing is that it doesn't have a particular cell type, and so we have everything from squamous to cuboidal to even some things that may even look columnar. And so when we look at them here, we have something that's flattened out. Here we have more of a cuboidal cell. Here we have a columnar cell. And so the different cells that we have there kind of come in all varieties. And the important thing is that this tissue, depending upon what state it's in when it's mounted on the microscope slide, dictates how much of each one we're really going to see, because it's stretchy. And so if we were to pull this tissue, in a sense, in either direction and stretch it out, we would then decrease the thickness and everything would become more squamous-like. And so this is designed to be able to be stretched out a little bit in places like the urinary bladder. Epithelial tissue also has the ability to form, in some cases, glands. And so we have two general classes of glands, endocrine glands and exocrine glands. For the endocrine glands, you'll talk about these in an entire chapter in A&P2. And the endocrine glands are, their hallmark structures are that they are ductless. So there's no duct associated with them. And then they produce hormones. And so those hormones are going to end up out into the bloodstream. So there's no need for a duct for them. And they come in many different varieties as far as the actual products that's there. But that's to be covered during the endocrine system. The exocrine glands are glands that do have ducts, and they again produce a large variety of different products within them. One of the main focuses that we'll look at for exocrine glands is in the skin and looking at the sweat glands. But they're also found in things like salivary glands within the body and digestive tract glands and things like that as well. And so we do have a large variety of the different types that are there. The majority of them are all multicellular, so there's a large number of cells within the gland itself, and goblet cells are really the only single-celled exocrine gland that we have. Depending upon the type of gland that we have, dictates how the cells produce their products. And so we can have merocrine glands. These ones are going to produce basically little packages, and those little packages are then exocytosed out of the cell. So we create little vesicles inside of them, and those vesicles then get exocytosed. Versus a holocrine gland, where the holocrine gland, basically the entire cell falls apart. And so the whole contents of the cell, including the cell itself, ends up going out with a holocrine gland. So holocrine gland we have here, where fragments of the entire cell are going out, versus in our merocrine gland, we're just secreting what's inside the vesicles. So the cells aren't being lost in this process. So with a holocrine gland, we have to reproduce the cells relatively often. Glands themselves can go through changes over time. We've all experienced the differences in sweat glands between kind of early childhood to adolescence to adulthood, and the changes that go on with those glands there, but they can also affect other things like lacrimal glands and salivary glands. And when that occurs, we can get what we call Sjogren's syndrome. And so with this, it's our own body attacking those glands and causing them to no longer function. And so this gives extremely dry eyes and dry mouth. And so kind of imagine a very, very hot and dry day, and the wind is blowing, and what that can do to your eyes as far as drying them out. Or imagine if you wake up in the morning and you've slept all night with your mouth open, your mouth is all dried out. Imagine that all day long. And that's kind of what happens with this. Next up, we have connective tissue. And so connective tissue's job is, as the name kind of implies, to connect. And so it's binding things together, it's providing for some protection, it allows us to insulate the body, and it also allows for us to transport. Connective tissue itself has some hallmarks to it as well, as far as the things that we're going to look for it within there. It does have cells, and so there is some cells to it that's there. The tissue itself here, whereas epithelium is completely avascular, this vascularity is going to vary, so from very highly vascular in places like adipose to relatively little vasculature in things like our dense, irregular connective tissue that we have. All of our connective tissue has some sort of fibers, and then it also has a non-living component. And so this is going to be what we call matrix. And this is the substance that kind of fills in the spaces between the fibers and the cells. And so this ground substance stuff is part of that matrix. And this is in between all of our cells and all of our fibers. For fibers, we have one of three kinds. We either have collagen fibers, elastic fibers, or reticular fibers, all giving different properties to the connective tissues themselves. And then the cells are dependent upon the type of connective tissue that we're in as well. Fibroblasts, chondroblasts, osteoblasts are all forming the different substances that we need within the different connective tissues. So this ground substance stuff is primarily uh, filled with things like water at times, and so we have interstitial fluid or extracellular fluid. Depending upon the area that we're in, there may be other adhesion proteins that are found in there. There may be more of a product that is going to work more like a filter or a molecular sieve to allow for us to transport nutrients through the tissue itself. The different fibers, we have collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and reticular fibers. Collagen fibers are very strong. They have a high tensile strength, meaning if we pull on them, they tend not to break, and they also don't stretch out. Versus an elastic fiber, they are stretchy. We pull on them, and it's kind of like a rubber band. It stretches out, and then it bounces back. Reticular connective tissue and fibers are actually collagen fibers that rather than, whereas collagen normally kind of goes all in the same line, when we see it with reticular fibers, they form more of a matrix, more of a net almost. And when we look at what reticular connective tissue is going to do, it'll make sense that it forms kind of this network of fibers. Connective tissues can have some issues with them as well, with their fibers. And so when somebody has a problem with their elastic fibers, one potential problem that they could have is Marfan syndrome. And so Marfan syndrome affects a single gene called the fibrillin gene, and that gene codes for elastic fibers. And so if those elastic fibers are too stretchy, that allows the tissue to stretch out more so than it should. And so, but the problem is that it's not just that it's extra stretchy, but it doesn't bounce back. And so that's where in the picture here, we have the ability to bend back the metacarpophalangeal joint to 90 degrees in extension. That shouldn't happen. Having extra loose joints is a problem, but the bigger problem is that we also have elastic fibers in places like blood vessels. And so they can lead to the larger blood vessels, our elastic arteries, stretching out too much, and the aorta may eventually rupture. So to look at our connective tissues, all connective tissues begin as mesenchyme. And so all connective tissues in the embryo start out as mesenchyme. And so that mesenchyme is our either mesenchyme or embryonic mesenchyme for the tissue itself. This is the precursor to all of our other connective tissues. Areolar connective tissue is unique in that it shows all three fiber types. And so we have elastic fibers, collagen fibers, and reticular fibers within the tissue itself. So it kind of combines all the characteristics of all three for them. Areolar connective tissue is kind of found in a large number of areas. We'll see it in the skin later on. We see it kind of surrounding organs, so kind of packaging them up in a sense within the body itself. Adipose doesn't have any visible fibers within it, but its hallmark is kind of unchanging as far as the ability to see it there. So we have these large, huge vacuoles inside of them, and these contain the lipids. And so each one of those is an individual cell. Oftentimes the nucleus is kind of pushed to the side, and we may not see it in that particular slice of the cell that's there, but they are there. Again, adipose, very widely distributed. We find it kind of all over the body. Under the skin, it's part of the hypodermis. It's in and around all of our organs. It serves as a good protection for the body. Reticular connective tissue has those reticular fibers. And so now we're going to take those collagen fibers and they're going to end up branching. So they go off and they have a whole bunch of branching to them. They're not just going in individual directions or anything. They change in terms of their thickness, and so the diameter of those fibers is not the same throughout the entire stretch, and so we can see that they go from being very thin to being very thick. They can change. These reticular fibers and reticular connective tissue is going to allow us to trap stuff inside there. And so we see it primarily within the lymphatic tissue, in that we have them in lymph nodes in the spleen. We come to more dense connective tissues. And so now all of those fibers are very highly densely packed together. And so we have our dense regular connective tissue. It's regular because the fibers are all going in the same direction. So although there's kind of a little wave in the tissues here, all of those fibers are all parallel to one another. And this is where we use them in places like tendons and ligaments. We can pull on them. They've got high tensile strength, and they're not going to break. Dense irregular connective tissue, the fibers themselves are going in lots of different directions. They're not all parallel to one another as we see them in the tissue. And when we look at what their function is, this is getting us back to that complementarity kind of an idea, is the tissues themselves are, where we find them, need to be able to move in kind of all directions. And so we find them a lot in joint capsules surrounding a particular joint, and so it's going to be able to resist motion in multiple directions. We find them in part of the skin, and so this gives kind of some of the resiliency to the skin. We can pull on it and tug on it and poke it, and it doesn't fail. We'll get into some cartilages, and so we have hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is very strong. It tends to have this kind of empty space to it, which is where we have all of our collagen fibers inside there. It doesn't really look like a whole lot, but it is there. And it becomes extremely strong. If you were to kind of poke your chest next to your sternum and find what kind of feels like a rib there, although it feels hard and rib-like, it's actually not a rib, it's actually cartilage. And so it's the hyaline cartilage that's there within the tissue itself. The hyaline cartilage also makes up things like the ends of the bones. And so this is going to be the protective structure that's in between the two bones. Elastic cartilage has that stretchiness of the elastic fibers themselves. Elastic cartilage is found in places like the ear. And so this is why you can bend and twist and things on your ear, and it bounces right back. As long as you don't cause any damage, it does bounce right back. But if we cause too much damage to it over time, we can get the infamous cauliflower ear. And so it starts to kind of twist and turn in on itself as it tries to heal. And then we have fibrocartilage. Fibrocartilage is taking those collagen fibers, and it almost looks like they're kind of like wispy. It always reminds me of kind of like cotton wool or something as they're being pulled apart. Like take a cotton ball and kind of tear it and pull it apart, and that's kind of what fibrocartilage looks like. Fibrocartilage, rather than being with those collagen fibers, rather than having kind of a tensile strength where we pull it, this gives it a very shock absorbance resistance. And so we find it in places like the intervertebral discs. We find it in places like the meniscus of the knee. And so in those places where we need to be able to absorb a tremendous amount of force. Next up, we have bone or osseous tissue. This osseous tissue is tissue that is very strong once again. The matrix has been calcified. So all of kind of the brown areas in between here is all calcified matrix. Makes it very strong, extremely strong, especially when we again kind of compress the bone, push the bone in on itself. If we put lateral force against it, they do oftentimes fail, simply because they're not meant to resist that type of stress. And then we have our only liquid connective tissue. And so blood is a type of connective tissue. All of the matrix is the plasma of the blood, and so it's all of the empty space that's inside here. There are a large amount of cells. It makes up almost 50% of the entire tissue itself is all cells within there. And the only place where we're supposed to find blood is inside the blood vessels or inside the heart. Next up, we have nervous tissue. And so nervous tissue is unique in terms of its appearance. It has these big, large cell bodies, or soma. And extending out from them, we have these processes. And so we have axons and dendrites that extend out from the cells themselves and go out and do the communication. So whereas kind of the neurons are the functional cells of nervous tissue, all the rest of these little dots that we have inside here, all of these other cells are the nuclei of the glial cells, or the supporting cells, which far outnumber the actual neurons that are there. We have three kinds of muscle tissue. So we have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle look similar to one another, but with skeletal muscle, all of the fibers are parallel to one another. They're all going in the same direction. They are striated. They kind of look like a worm or something in terms of the striations that they have that are there. And one of the hallmarks of skeletal muscle is that they are multinucleated. And so there's more than one nucleus per cell. When we look at cardiac muscle is single nucleated. It still has the striations. And it has what appears to be darker striations. These are actually what are called intercalated discs. And these discs are in between individual cells. They allow for communication of cellular content, primarily calcium, from one cell to the next. Cardiac muscle cells also, unlike skeletal muscle, branch. And so they're not just big long cylinders, they actually branch off in more than one direction. And that kind of makes sense when we start to think about the heart, in that it's got to squeeze in on itself. So it's not just pulling from one spot to the next. Smooth muscle looks nothing like the other two. Smooth muscle is spindle-shaped. So our smooth muscle here has kind of a spindle shape to it. And so it's thicker in the middle and thinner at the ends. See if I can draw a better one here. And so that's our general shape to the cells. There's no visible striations on it, so we can't see any striations in it. It does have generally a central kind of nucleus to it. And they stack themselves together like sheets. Connective tissues have further issues to them sometimes as well. And so we can have things like systemic lupus erythematosus, or SLE, or just oftentimes just lupus. This tends to affect females more than it does males, and so it has a preponderance of cases that are more females. They tend to be kind of in the 18 to 45 years of age when diagnosis occurs. Diagnosis can be difficult because oftentimes it does affect more than one tissue, and it doesn't affect them all at the same time. So a person may have a skin rash, like we have here. This is what's referred to as a malar rash. It kind of goes over the bridge of the nose and onto the cheeks. We can see it there in the cheek there also. And with this is kind of some of the hallmarks of lupus. And when we see that there, it may be this way this time, but the next time they may have kidney problems, the next time they may have heart problems. It just depends on what connective tissue it's affecting at any given time. Ultimately, they tend to end up having kidney failure as being one of the things that becomes the late stages of the disease. With connective tissues, similar to that of all of the body itself, we said that we start out with different components for growth of cells, and that occurs from one of three germ layers. And so we have either our ectoderm, mesoderm, or endoderm, depending upon where we are in that development of the tissues themselves. And so each general class is generally going to come from one of these three types that are there. Nervous tissue develops typically from ectoderm. Muscle, a lot of our connective tissue develops from mesoderm, And then the endoderm is things like our epithelium and things like that. But epithelium doesn't just stick with the endoderm, it actually goes through all three. And so when we look at kind of an early embryo here in terms of the tissue development, we see that we have essentially kind of layers of tissue in there, and that we have our endoderm on the yellow, we have our mesoderm in the middle, and then we have our ectoderm right there on the outside there. And so in the end, essentially the ectoderm is going to become the inside, the mesoderm is kind of the middle, and then the endoderm is the outside, things like epithelial tissues and so on. And then from there, we will start to get into our actual tissue organs themselves.